They told us the International Monetary Fund existed to help, to stabilize, to guide economies through storms and crises. But behind every assistance package, behind every development loan, there was always a hidden clause, a quiet line buried deep in the paperwork that said, "We own you now." For decades, Africa's destiny was rewritten in boardrooms thousands of miles away, not by elected leaders, not by the people, but by economists who had never set foot on our soil. They spoke in numbers, in graphs, in models, but those numbers were our lives. Those models were our hunger. Those graphs were our future, flattened into spreadsheets and debt ratios. Every bailout came with a cost that no one explained at first. Sell your resources, privatize your industries, cut subsidies for your people, open your markets to foreign corporations. They called it economic reform, but reform for whom? When Ghana discovered oil, the IMF was there. When Zambia struck copper deals, the IMF was there. When Nigeria found natural gas, the IMF was there. Each time they offered advice, technical guidance, fiscal discipline. Each time the same pattern repeated, profits flowed out, debts stayed in. The continent that feeds the world remained hungry. They said we were mismanaging our economies. They said corruption was our disease. But what if corruption wasn't just inside governments? What if corruption wore suits in Washington, spoke in policy terms, and called itself conditional lending? The IMF wasn't just lending money, it was buying influence. It was rewriting constitutions, reshaping education, dictating what entire nations could spend on healthcare or food. They called it macroeconomic stability. We called it control. Africa's biggest secret isn't buried under its soil. It's hidden in contracts and the agreements signed under pressure when leaders desperate for short-term survival traded their people's future for temporary relief. Those documents are our invisible chains. And now, those chains are being exposed. Because something has changed. Quietly, beneath the surface, a new generation of African economists, engineers, and thinkers have started asking forbidden questions. What if the debt is illegitimate? What if the value of our currencies was never meant to rise? What if the aid we receive is just interest payment in disguise? The world isn't ready for the answers, but we are. They thought Africa would never question the system that shaped it. But the mask has cracked. The truth is spreading. From Nairobi to Bamako, from Lagos to Lusaka, people are beginning to understand. The IMF's power was never about money, it was about permission. And now, for the first time in modern history, Africa no longer needs permission. They call it structural adjustment. A phrase so polished, so academic, it almost sounds scientific. But what it really means is dismantling a nation piece by piece until it fits someone else's blueprint. They tell you to liberalize your economy, meaning foreign corporations can buy what generations of Africans built. They tell you to remove subsidies, meaning the poor must now pay full price for food, water, fuel, electricity. They tell you to cut public spending, meaning hospitals run out of medicine, schools out of teachers, communities out of hope. And when the people protest, they say it's civil unrest. When governments resist, they say it's instability. But when nations obey, when they comply, they call it progress. Progress, they say, is when profits move north and debt moves south. The IMF never fires a bullet, but its policies have done what wars could not, kept entire continents dependent. Through currency manipulation, interest traps, and austerity, it's turned independence into illusion. Every so-called rescue plan begins with the same ritual. Delegations arrive in dark suits, smiling for cameras. They speak softly of reforms, targets, benchmarks. They promise brighter tomorrows, but those tomorrows never come. Because the truth is simple. The IMF doesn't fix economies. It manages dependency. It keeps nations in perpetual motion, working, producing, exporting, but never arriving. Every loan comes with a script. Privatize your energy sector. Deregulate your banks. Devalue your currency. Increase taxes on your poor. Reduce spending on your people. And after all that, borrow again to fix the damage. It's a cycle designed to never end. They said Africa was rich in resources but poor in management. But what if the real mismanagement was orchestrated? What if the system was designed not to lift us but to contain us? For decades, African leaders have been told, you have no choice. But that lie is dying. Because something new is rising quietly, defiantly from within. Young Africans no longer dream of escaping the continent, they dream of rebuilding it. Coders are building African payment systems. Economists are drafting African monetary unions. Farmers are trading directly across borders without intermediaries. A generation unafraid to question sacred institutions is emerging, and when you question power, power trembles. The IMF's greatest fear isn't revolution in the streets, it's revelation in the minds. The moment people understand that financial control is the modern chain, that's when the empire begins to collapse. And make no mistake, it's collapsing. From West Africa to the Horn, leaders are refusing conditional loans, nations are linking trade through local currencies, gold-backed systems are returning, regional alliances are forming without Western oversight. The story of Africa is being rewritten not in IMF offices, but on African soil, by African hands. This is not the end of the IMF, but it is the end of its invisibility. It started with a leak. A folder sent anonymously to a Nairobi newsroom, encrypted files, internal communications, policy drafts never meant to be seen by the public. At first, the journalists thought it was fake. The IMF doesn't make mistakes like this. But when they cross-checked the documents, signatures matched, timestamps aligned, metadata confirmed authenticity. Inside were memos, cold, bureaucratic, precise. Lines like, strategic objective, maintain currency dependence across target regions, or reduce regional banking autonomy to limit uncontrolled fiscal independence. And the most chilling one of all, risk of self-sufficient African economies presents long-term threat to IMF leverage. They had written it openly, not as conspiracy, not as secret plotting, just standard procedure, because for them, control had become normal. But when the truth reached the people, normal shattered. From Ghana to Tanzania, the files spread like wildfire. People began to see what was hidden behind the polite smiles and polite loans. The IMF didn't just influence governments, it engineered them. The policies choking local industries, the currency collapses, the budget cuts, they were not accidents, they were strategies. And in that moment, something historic happened. Silence broke. Economists who had stayed quiet for decades began speaking. Former finance ministers admitted how they'd been pressured to sign deals that drained their reserves. Young analysts inside African central banks leaked data showing how interest rate controls were manipulated externally. For the first time, people connected the dots between poverty and policy and realized both were manufactured. The IMF called it misinterpretation. They said the documents were taken out of context, but every line read like confession. Every chart, every projection, every meeting note revealed the same truth. Africa was never meant to stand independently. But the truth has momentum, and once it starts rolling, it doesn't stop. Social media turned into classrooms. Economists broke down the leaked data into simple terms. Activists translated it into local languages. Students debated it in university halls. The continent began to understand itself. And understanding is revolution. Suddenly, people weren't just angry, they were strategic. Movements formed not to protest, but to replace. Technologists began designing African-led financial frameworks. Economists proposed community-backed reserve systems. Engineers coded open ledger solutions that didn't rely on Western servers. For every clause they had written to ensure control, Africa was writing new code to dismantle it. The IMF's greatest weapon had always been ignorance, the complexity of economics, the mystery of finance, the illusion that the system was too big to challenge. But now, the veil was gone. The people had seen behind the curtain, and once you see power naked, you never fear it again. In that moment, Africa realized something profound. We were not poor, we were made poor. And what is made can be unmade. The world watched in silence. Western media called it a temporary disturbance in African markets. But it was not temporary, it was not disturbance, it was awakening. For decades, Africa had been told it was too divided to act together, too different, too unstable, too dependent. But when the IMF's secrets came to light, those divisions began to dissolve. Because truth unites faster than treaties. In Dakar, young economists gathered under candlelight, building models for a unified African reserve system. In Lagos, coders created digital payment platforms that bypassed SWIFT entirely. In Nairobi, journalists coordinated an international investigation, connecting patterns between IMF loans and political outcomes across 40 nations. In Accra, university students held night-long debates about sovereignty, debt cancellation, and the meaning of freedom in the 21st century. And something unexpected happened. Governments started listening. One by one, ministers who had spent years defending the IMF began to shift their tone. They spoke of reassessing partnerships, of strategic independence, of regional integration. It was cautious language, diplomatic, but the meaning was unmistakable. The tide had turned. The IMF responded the only way it knew how: pressure. Sudden downgrades by credit rating agencies, threats of investment withdrawal, warnings that currencies would collapse without support. It was financial warfare disguised as advice. But this time, Africa didn't flinch. Because this time, Africa had alternatives. Regional trade was growing faster than foreign aid. Local investors were stepping in where foreign ones had pulled out. And the most powerful shift of all, ordinary citizens had lost their fear. They began demanding transparency in every deal signed with foreign institutions. They began asking where the money went, who controlled it, and what it cost their children's futures. Accountability became contagious. In the past, exposure meant punishment, sanctions, embargoes, isolation. But now, exposure meant power. The more truth spread, the weaker the IMF's grip became. For the first time in history, African leaders met without intermediaries in the room. No advisors from Washington, no consultants from Brussels. Just Africans, talking to Africans about African futures. They didn't always agree, but they agreed on one thing: never again. Never again would one institution decide the fate of 1 billion people. Never again would poverty be the price of obedience. Never again would debt be used as a leash. Across the continent, something ancient began to reawaken: the spirit of self-determination. It wasn't new. It had just been buried under decades of paperwork, policies, and promises that led nowhere. Now it was back, and it was louder than ever. The IMF could influence currencies, but it couldn't control conviction. It could pressure leaders, but it couldn't silence a continent that had finally understood its worth. And as Africa's collective heartbeat began to synchronize, one question echoed across its cities, its villages, its capitals: if we could rebuild our economies without them, what else could we rebuild? It began quietly, like all revolutions do. No parades, no speeches, just action. The first move came from West Africa. A coalition of finance ministers announced the creation of a continental settlement network, an African-led payment system that allowed trade in local currencies. No dollar conversions, no foreign intermediaries, just pure value, moving from African hands to African hands. They called it Ubuntu Pay. Its principle was simple: if we trust each other, we don't need permission. The launch sent shockwaves through financial circles. The IMF issued a statement calling it premature and potentially destabilizing. The World Bank called for further consultation. Western economists dismissed it as symbolic. But it wasn't symbolic. It was sovereign. Within weeks, trade between Ghana, Nigeria, and Côte d'Ivoire began to flow directly through Ubuntu Pay. Cocoa exports, textile imports, and energy contracts all settled in real time. No delays, no gatekeepers. Then East Africa followed. Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia signed a pact to create a regional reserve fund designed to cushion their economies without IMF loans. It was a simple idea with radical implications. We will save together so we never have to borrow apart. And when the IMF warned of credit risks, the African Union responded with one sentence that would make history: dependency is the highest risk of all. That line echoed around the world. Suddenly, news channels that had ignored Africa's reforms for decades began to pay attention. Investors who once dismissed African markets as too unstable started calling them too independent. The narrative was shifting, and this time, Africa was writing it. Meanwhile, the IMF's control mechanisms began to weaken. Without dollar-based intermediaries, it could no longer monitor transactions. Without loan dependency, it could no longer dictate national budgets. Without fear, it could no longer manipulate leadership. And behind all of this was Africa's greatest weapon: its youth. Young Africans weren't waiting for permission to innovate. Developers built decentralized finance apps that bypassed central control. Entrepreneurs created micro-lending systems within villages using digital wallets. Communities crowdfunded infrastructure wells, solar grids, schools without touching a single foreign loan. They didn't just talk about independence. They coded it. The IMF tried to regain footing through strategic partnerships, offering technical assistance. But the facade was gone. The continent had learned to read between the lines, and beneath the compliments, it always found control. And when they realized they couldn't control the systems anymore, they tried to control the story. They called it economic isolation. They called it risk to global stability. But the people knew what it really was: liberation. For the first time in living memory, Africa's fate was not being debated in Washington or Brussels, it was being decided in Nairobi, Accra, Kigali, and Ouagadougou. The IMF had been exposed, not just as a financial institution, but as a system of belief, a belief that Africa couldn't stand without permission. And when that belief died, the empire that depended on it began to crumble. The ripple began as a tremor, then grew into a quake. When Africa changed, the world felt it. Commodity prices shifted. Currency values fluctuated. Trade routes redrew themselves. The very equations that global economists swore by began to break, because they were built on one assumption, that Africa would always play its assigned role: supplier, borrower, subordinate. But Africa had changed the script. Suddenly, gold from Mali and Zimbabwe wasn't being sold for dollars, but traded directly for technology, food, and machinery within the continent. Oil from Nigeria moved through African tankers, settled in Ubuntu Pay, never touching Western banks. Cocoa, copper, cobalt, the backbone of modern industry, began to flow through African-led trade corridors. The old powers panicked. For the first time, they couldn't see where the money was going. For the first time, they couldn't predict who was controlling global supply. For the first time, the invisible hand of control slipped. In Geneva, IMF officials convened emergency meetings. The transcripts would later leak. They spoke of systemic exposure, loss of compliance leverage, and strategic deterioration of fiscal influence. In simple words, they were losing control. Western media began running stories with alarmist titles: The African Economic Experiment, A Threat to Global Stability, De-dollarization Risks Loom. But to Africans, it wasn't a threat, it was justice. The streets of Accra, Addis Ababa, and Kigali buzzed with a confidence unseen in decades. Murals appeared on city walls, painted fists breaking chains made of dollar signs. In markets, merchants joked that the IMF had finally discovered what hunger feels like: hunger for relevance. For the first time, Africa was not reacting to global economics. The world was reacting to Africa. But power never concedes quietly. Behind closed doors, the IMF and its allies began plotting containment strategies. Sanctions disguised as compliance measures. Data restrictions on African fintech systems. Diplomatic pressure framed as security cooperation. All designed to slow the momentum, to remind the continent that freedom comes with a price. Yet the price had already been paid. Decades of exploitation, centuries of resource theft, generations of lost potential. Africa had already paid in full. And this time, it wasn't negotiating. African leaders began speaking with a new language: calm, precise, unafraid. They didn't beg, they didn't apologize, they simply stated facts. Our resources are not collateral, they are capital. Our sovereignty is not negotiable, it is absolute. Every press conference, every summit, every televised debate carried the same undertone: we remember what you did, and we are done pretending we don't. The IMF could issue warnings, but warnings no longer carried fear. Fear had lost its authority. Across the continent, from Cape Town to Cairo, a sentence began to circulate online, handwritten on posters, painted on walls, printed on shirts: they can't bankrupt what they don't own.